right. How are you?
I'm well. Welcome to the show, as they say. What are you drinking?
I'm really, really excited. I'm just drinking water today,
Yeah, well,
mostly because I've already had two coffees because it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon here. So,
sure. This is hot tea because it's now just a little after 10 here. So how has the creative flow been during all of this madness?
oh, there hasn't been one. I hate like seeing like posts. I'm really pleased for other writers and artists who've been like, I've never been more creative, and I sit there going, how?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
I
like too much brain space is taken up by like teaching online, like for my day job and my client work, my PhD, and doing my podcast. So I just kind of sit there going, "Oh, writing's just gonna have to wait."
I had the same. When it kicked off and we were stuck at home. I had about a week, maybe two, where I thought I'm gonna teach myself to draw. This is gonna be amazing. That lasted about that long, and then I started feeling bad that I wasn't more productive, and then yeah, it's been a mess. All right, so we have a lot of ground with you. I do want to start. So I met Icy, met about a decade ago in a group that we wrote flash fiction, right? Like just short pieces in and out. So how I've always wondered how did you land on Icy Sedgwick?
It's one of those stories where a lot of things that I come out with will begin with it seemed like a good idea at the time. And this is one of those things. And it all dates back to the good old days of message boards and forums, like way before Facebook and even MySpace, actually. And I had a username and it incorporated the word icy. And over time, it gradually, like, because people used to refer to each other by their user handles
Sure.
because like we were so cool back then. And yeah, and then it got shortened down to Icy, and then that stuck as a nickname. And then when I started sending out short stories, I thought, oh well, I should send a name that's memorable and that people might remember and it'll stick in their mind, kind of thing, or it might like grab their attention. And completely ignoring the fact that everyone always spells my surname wrong, I decided to change the first name instead. And it does kind of work because, like, I'll jump on a webinar with someone, and they'll like when they're picking out like who's attending, and they'll be like, "Oh, hey, Icy's here," and I'm kind of like, "Oh," but then I realize that like it's probably because most people either ask, "Hey, how do you pronounce it?" and I'm like the weather condition, um, or they ask if it's short for something, and I'm like, it's like the weather condition.
Yeah.
And it's really annoying because I set up a Google alert for whenever like Icy Sedgwick appears in anything. And honestly, like I get so many weather reports for Sedgwick County in the winter, and I'm like, okay,
Yeah,
that's not what I
that's
asked.
hilarious.
And then I got so far in that I was then like, oh, okay, I'm gonna just have to run with this now. So that's where Icy came from. It was basically originally an attempt to be memorable, and now I'm probably memorable for all the wrong reasons.
Hey, it works. Yeah, I mean, good, bad, or indifferent, it is memorable. All right, so since we did meet in writing, I want to start with the writing stuff. It was a lot of your goth horror, supernatural at least bent work. Where does that draw come from for you?
Um, Basically, I think a lot of things I'm interested in all come from the same sort of root. And I think it's partly my mother's fault. But it's basically because when I was little, we used to go to like obviously stately homes and castles, and there's like so many of them in the county where I live and where I'm from. And they would always have like books of ghost stories for the local area. So I would always end up collecting them. And then it became a thing like, oh, we're going to Norfolk, let's get some ghost stories. We're going to Devon, let's get some ghost stories, and so on and so forth. And it got to the point where like I would read them everywhere I went. So it kind of stood to reason that when I then started to write my own stuff, I mean, I've been writing stories. I'm one of those irritating writers who's been writing as long as I can remember, but there's usually been something supernatural or weird in them because it was what I was consuming. And I mean, I was 13 when I read The Shining purely because Joy was reading it in Friends, and I wanted to see if it was actually that scary. Um, so yeah, so I discovered horror really early on, and then sort of like went from The Shining backwards to like Dracula and Frankenstein and stuff, as you do.
Sure.
Um, and I guess it all kind of came from there. and then it just kind of expanded out beyond that once I discovered like proper horror cinema when I was doing my degree, and sort of used to watch like the X-Files and things when I was at school. And so it's just basically I've always been drawn towards that sort of end of the sort of like inspirational spectrum, shall we say.
Very cool. As it, would you say? Okay, let's see. Where where are is that your literary influences? Do they come mostly from like a king, or who influences your style?
um I've no idea. I know I heard people compare me to, but I don't necessarily know that I consciously try to imitate them. I mean, somebody once described the Necromancer's Apprentice as feeling a little bit like if Tim Burton had directed Harry Potter, and I'm like, oh my god, that is a film I would love to have seen.
No kidding.
Yeah, that would have been amazing. Um, and like people have compared me to Terry Pratchett, despite the fact I've only ever read two of his books. Um, but I think it would probably be more likely, uh, if I was to say anyone, it would be more likely Neil Gaiman.
Okay.
Um, Purely because he's got such a range as well. He doesn't just do one kind of story, and like neither do I.
Yeah.
But I think because he's got that sense almost of like the weird and the everyday, um, that's kind of where I sort of sit. So even though like I've read, like the classic ghost stories like M.R. James and people like that, I still kind of end up wandering back to the sort of not magical realism, that's the wrong word, but yeah, it's that kind of more like uncanny sort of fiction.
Right. Okay. Very cool. So I Magician's Apprentice, well, the Magic and Mayhem series, I dug both of those. I actually like the Tim Burton directing Harry Potter, and that's I can see that actually. The first thing I ever bought of yours was the Gray O'Donnell
Mm.
series, and I have always meant to ask you, how does someone that was from Newcastle upon Tyne write a western set in Arizona?
Yeah, it does seem a bit weird, and it's quite funny because one of my reviews does draw attention to the fact that I'm a young lady who should write what I know, apparently, because I forgot how many like Western writers were there.
Right.
Um, the, the basically what happened was I'd always had it in mind that I wanted to write a series set in the Old West because I studied it for history at school. I always wanted to do one set in the Old West. It was like the equivalent of like Hellblazer, so like John Constantine, but in the Old West.
Right.
Never got around to it. And then, but I'd always been fascinated by like westerns and stuff, and like my granddad used to read them, and so on and so forth. And then I was posting all that flash fiction on my website, and my blog and whatnot. And this editor got in touch, and he's like, "Oh, I'm looking for writers to write novellas in these set genres." And I can't remember what all of them were, but one of them was a western. I was like, "Yes, this is it. This is me chance."
Right.
So, and because it had to be on the theme of revenge or retribution, that's how the Guns of Retribution was then born. Because I thought, well, that would make a good name for a town because they've all got weird names like that. And then I ended up actually writing that one backwards because I had to start with the ending and then obviously go, well, why would someone be in that position? Why would someone be seeking revenge and so on? So that was kind of again another. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Um, and then I ended up writing the second one um, because the first somebody else had taken up because there was reasons why the publisher couldn't continue with the first one, and then someone else took it on, and obviously they were happy to do a sequel. And then that one, people really didn't get that it was meant to be a weird western, not a
Yeah.
general western, so that one didn't go down as well, which is why there hasn't been any more.
That's too bad. Do you Which world was easier for you, the Magic and Mayhem or the O'Donnell? Like which one was easier to quickly inhabit to work in again?
I would probably say the Magic and Mayhem one purely because I made it up from scratch.
Yeah.
And I've got quite a good grasp on like the geography of the place in my head, and because it's essentially a mashup of lots of places I've actually visited, it's quite easy to then mentally orient myself in any of these places. Whereas, I mean, the Grey O'Donnell stuff's fun. Don't get me wrong. It's just because you've got to like abide by like historical accuracy and stuff. Because I always really researched them because I thought You can slag off the plot or anything like that. I really don't mind, but I don't want you saying that they haven't been researched properly.
Yeah,
Um, but obviously the Magic and Mayhem ones, because they're about a necromancer, I can pretty much do what I want, so it is a little bit easier.
that's
Um,
true. Very cool. I Are there any? Let's see. I'm trying to remember if I've read two Magic and Mayhem, but there's a prelude. Can't remember. I don't think I've read the prelude. Do you have any more that are coming from there?
yeah, there's the third book, which is basically to finish the initial trilogy. Is about 2/3 of the way through because I was in the middle of writing that when like the pandemic started, and then I found it really difficult to go back to. And of course, the problem with it is, I know how it's going to end, so it's just basically getting from where I am now to the ending. Um, but the problem that I had was I'd like gone back and changed things loads of time. So then, like, I now know what the narrative is going to be, but I have to basically go back and then fix all my plot holes before I then keep going. Otherwise, it's just going to be a hideous mess. So I'm basically in the kind of catching up with myself to put it on because I changed who the villain was like 4 times. So like I keep coming across remnants of when it was someone else and going, no, 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 I have to change that because that's going to irritate me otherwise. Um, so yeah, that's basically where I'm up to. But it's just I'm finding creative stuff, like I say, really difficult at the moment. But there are going to be more books, and one of the things I want to do is actually do like an offshoot with one of the well, she's like the second protagonist of Necromancer's Rogues. I want to kind of give her some because she's just more interesting. So I want
Okay,
to give her some more stuff to do.
oh, that's cool. All right, I do. So you have a fantastic podcast that I want to get into, but before I do that, as a segue to that, you also have a crocheted mummy that I've seen countless pictures of. Where what is that about?
She basically I learned to crochet. Oh, must have been about 10 years ago now. And I've also got the Grim Reaper as well, who now has his own Instagram account because that seemed like a good idea. Um, but oh yeah, it was just I was I can't remember why I did a mummy. I think it was just because if I had a book of like horror movie monsters, like crochet patterns for them, and like I've crocheted Nosferatu, I've done Cthulhu, obviously done the Grim Reaper, and there wasn't a mummy in there, which I thought was a bit of an oversight. So I do have a book of knitted zombies, which has a mummy pattern in, but I thought no, I want to make me a mummy, so I did. And I sort of just adapted the pattern slightly. And then it just became a thing where I would take her places and photograph her there. And so she's based on like one of the mummies in Necromancer's Apprentice.
That's what I
Um,
assumed.
yeah, and it's always a bit of a dent to the ego where I'll be like, here's mummy at the Palace of Versailles, here's me at the Palace of Versailles, and she gets more likes than I do, and I'm always a little bit like, oh, um, and but yeah, she's quite funny because I've got what I call a stunt double, so I've got like a two-dimensional version like stuck on foam board. So if I'm worried about losing the actual mummy, I'll use the cut out version instead, just to because I wouldn't be so bothered if I lost the foam one, but she's literally a one-off, so I'm always a bit careful with her for that.
Wow, that's no, that's cool actually. Like that, it reminds me of there used to be a I don't remember how far ranging the commercial was, but there used to be an ad thing with a gnome, and the gnome was like be in the ads, and they'd be around the world, and that's what reminds me of whenever like she's posed in a different spot. That's awesome though. I actually like that. All right, so fabulous folklore. Tell us what's where did that come from, and what
Um,
is it, and where did it come from?
the longer version, I've got to kind of give a little bit of backstory, and that was 5 years ago, I think it is roughly. I noticed this hashtag on Twitter, Folklore Thursday. It's amazing. Check it out. And I mean, there's other ones as well, but that's the main one. And I started tweeting because obviously all these books of ghost stories from back in the day that would be getting since I was about 10 have a lot of folklore in them. And the part of the world I'm in, like human occupation goes back, you know, as far as you can imagine. So there's a lot of stories. There's border wars and all sorts. It's like it is literally like living in Game of Thrones kind of territory. And so of course I started tweeting various bits of folklore that I'd been learning and reading over the years. And then I started blogging about it. And because my thinking was, oh, well, I've got folklore elements that have inspired some of my short stories, like the gothic horror stuff.
Right.
To be fair, my inspiration is often more something I've seen in folklore rather than other writers. So I thought, I'll hopefully people who then come to my blog for the folklore will also like my books. That was my thinking. And then instead, the people seem to prefer the folklore stuff than the fiction. So it's kind of like, well, I'll just keep doing the folklore then.
Yeah.
And I must have been, because I remember my very first one was in 2016. That was the first time I actually specifically wrote a blog post about folklore for Folklore Thursday. And obviously, I've since contributed articles to the Folklore Thursday website as well. And then I was reading a book about like content marketing, which is like my favorite method of marketing. And they were like, oh, you know, if you've done one type of content, you should do another. So if you've got written content, you should also have audio as well, or video, or whatever it might be. So I was like, well, actually, from an accessibility point of view, I could quite easily narrate my blog post. So then if you land on my blog, like rather than having a screen reader do it, why not have me do it?
Sure.
So I started doing audio versions of my blog posts and then just uploading them to a platform called Hear This, and then just embedding the player in the blog post. And then I suddenly realized one day while I was having a bit of fiddle with the settings that Hear This also had an RSS feed option. So like for a laugh, I just kind of threw it on like Apple Podcasts and Spotify and stuff, and then they all accepted it. And I was like, oh, I've got a podcast now. Oh well, I should probably start actually promoting it and stuff. And it was like my partner at the time. He did a theme tune for us. He's since done another one that I use for other stuff, but so he did as a theme tune, which is like the Calliope music
Yeah.
at the beginning, which I absolutely love.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, it's a great segue into an episode.
And it was because that I knew that was the sound I was going for, like that kind of creepy fairground thing.
Yeah.
So it was, and then from there I just kind of added other bits, and then started the Patreon for it and everything, and it sort of kind of has grown into its own thing. And now obviously I've also put the episodes on YouTube, so there's no video to go with them, but because I know not everybody has Apple Podcasts, not everyone uses Spotify, but most people use YouTube. And so again, it's that attitude of kind of putting the content in as many places as possible. So if somebody say wants captions, well, the blog post is there for them if they want to read it, or they can listen to it if they prefer. So it's kind of trying to meet people where they're at. And obviously I do find that people listen to the podcast who never read the blog, which is really interesting, because I've had people sort of say, oh, I listen when I'm walking the dog, I listen when I'm doing the gardening, I listen when I'm doing the dishes, because the episodes are rarely longer than 20 minutes. They used to be 15 minutes, which is where the tagline was get your fix of fabulous folklore in 15 minutes or less. But then the episodes started getting slightly longer and slightly longer. So I try and keep them to about 20 minutes or so, because then it's like they're quite easy to digest, they're quite bite-sized, and it's not me just talking at someone for an hour, which I could quite easily do, but I don't know how many people would necessarily want me
No,
to.
given your content, I imagine it'd go over pretty well.
But I know people like binge on them, so it was hilarious because at the end of the year when Spotify tells you like how much you've listened to of something,
Right.
somebody listened to like 13 episodes of Fabulous Folklore in one go, and I was just like, that's like 4.5 hours of just listening to me.
Well, that's cool though. All right, so I mean, you had been doing it for a while before I listened to an episode, and then I went back and listened to, it was your first one, The Hand of Glory?
Mm-hmm.
That, yeah. And so, all right, which begs the question, how do you decide week to week where you're going to go?
Originally it used to just be kind of whatever I fancied writing about that particular week. So things like The Hand of Glory, because it's basically like local folklore and it's weird, so that went in. And like if I discovered the concept of something or someone was talking about something, I'll go, oh, that might make a good blog post. And then I started trying to do them in themes for every month.
Okay.
Because some people sign up to get like a notification every time one goes live, but they only get the monthly digest, so it's like all of the links of that month rather than getting an email every week. So I thought, well, that's going to look really, really strange if it's like four totally different things. So I'll put them together as themes, and a lot of the time they're dictated by requests, and I think that the theme came from I think it was the summer in 2019. One of my listeners had said, "Oh, could you do something on like water folklore and things to do with like water and Greek myth and stuff like the sirens and mermaids and so on." And there was enough there to get 4 blog posts out of it. So I was kind of like, "Oh, actually, this makes more sense doing it like this." So I started doing it monthly, and then within that, I basically either check if I've got old blog posts on the topic and then update them, or go out and write new ones. So like all the ones in February have been sort of generated now that I didn't have a previous one to base them on, and so it's kind of a combination of requests and stuff that I've come across where I'm like, oh, that would be quite good. Because sometimes the requests are quite vague, because it can just be like, have you got anything on the folklore of trees? So
Yeah.
that's broad enough that I can choose what to do within that. Whereas somebody asked for something based around astrology, which is actually a little bit more focused, hence the origin myths of this. Um, it ends up kind of being a combination of what I find interesting and what people have asked for.
All right. Do you have a mythology that's like that's you love that more than other mythology, or are you just taking all comers at this point?
Um, I try not to take the kind of pick and mix approach that some people do, because obviously there's certain uh the mythologies but also worldviews and stuff where I sort of think that's like a living tradition that I'm not part of. So that's not for me to share that. I will absolutely promote the people who do though. So instead I try and focus on sort of things that would realistically have some bearing on where I'm from. So, like Roman mythology is a really good one for me because there's so much evidence of Roman worship along Hadrian's Wall, which is literally down the road from me. So it's kind of
Uh,
like, and obviously Greek mythology because that kind of inspires everything else. Well, not everything else, but a lot of other sort of practices and so on. Greek mythology is quite interesting, and there's just so much drama. You're kind of they're like they're myths with a capital M.
yeah.
I mean, I do absolutely love ancient Egypt and their mythology, but it's just been one of those things where it's just never kind of come up, as it were, on the blog. So I do tend to kind of stick with European and Northern European where I can. Um, and but then again, I generally find when I look at like my analytics, listeners prefer the more kind of folklore and superstition based stuff rather than the specific mythology things. So it's quite interesting seeing what people are interested in.
I imagine. I imagine that, yeah, your analytics would be make for an interesting view. So is there any well untapped at this point, like something that you haven't touched that you're going to touch on that you're really excited about learning more and sharing more about?
Um, well, I mean, the thing is, it's like I get really excited about stuff that a lot of people kind of find a bit ghoulish and a bit morbid. So, like, I'm really fascinated in a lot of the stuff around like death rituals and death practices and things like that, and like death folklore in general. But that's one of the things that I can see with my analytics isn't necessarily that popular.
I gotcha.
Um, so it's usually then kind of ways of fitting that in with um other things that I'm looking at. I know at some point I really want to do the Arthurian legends because you'd think that would be a really obvious one for me to have done, and I've touched on them occasionally, but not in depth enough. So I do want to look at those at some point. Um, and I mean, I did do a talk with Romance and the Gothic a couple of Saturdays ago, I think it was, on folklore from like my part of the world, so like from Northumberland. Um, and I would quite like to sort of go back to that again, but again, it's the kind of thing that I find it quite interesting. But then when I put it on the podcast, it doesn't do as well as some of the other stuff.
Right.
But I don't know. It's weird because I've got a list of topics that people have asked for, and some of them I think, oh wow, that's going to be really good. Like people have asked for sort of episodes on like specific um well, not specific places, but just more kind of like types of place, like for example, stone circles and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, that'll be really interesting. That'll be really good. And I think there's so much untapped British folklore, and I do mean as in the whole of the British Isles, because people tend to kind of gravitate towards particular types of story, and I'm like, oh, there's got to be more in there.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I think that it tends to be the kind of thing where I'll suddenly come across it and go, oh, I really hadn't even considered doing that before. So I guess it's one of those things that we'll see.
How, I mean, it seems like you're the tank is pretty full on the podcast. I mean, is it, you're just going to keep doing it as long as it's fun, or do you have any kind of game plan on that front?
I mean, ultimately, it would be nice to make it like a major source of income, because then I can justify devoting more time to it and therefore creating more content for it. Because there does come a sort of a point where, you know, when you first start out, you're essentially giving away content for free.
Right.
And then it gets to a point where you're like, well, okay, I'm now getting some money coming in, which is at least covering sort of my outgoings, so my financial outgo, but still isn't covering my time. So I'd quite like to get to the point where it's at least covering the time that I put in now.
Right. We're winding down here. Where can everybody find you?
Oh, everywhere. If you look on like any podcast platform and Google, or look up Fabulous Folklore, I should show up. And if you look on YouTube as well, that should take you. I don't have a specific channel for Fabulous Folklore because again I didn't think that far ahead, so I just thought I'd put them on mine.
Yeah.
But if you look up Icy Sedgwick, they're on there. I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Pinterest as Icy Sedgwick because I'm really original like that with my usernames. And then I'm on my Facebook page is Miss Icy Sedgwick because I was already using Icy Sedgwick for my profile. Yeah, and then obviously my website's icysedgwick.com, so there's links outwards from there to pretty much everywhere.
And you said you had Patreon?
Yeah, and that's again just Icy Sedgwick.
Gotcha. All right, and I'll put everything down below, all the places that you just mentioned, so everybody can find you. Thanks for having a drink with me.
No problem.
I will talk to you later.
Cheerio.
And that wraps up our visit. Remember, if you'd like to get together and have a drink, just reach out. We'll put something on the books. In the meantime, like, share, subscribe, do all the things below. Until next time.